So let's start with a little interaction. Okay, we're going to be doing this a couple times throughout the seminar, so it's not just you guys listening to me, because I don't know about you, I even have a hard time getting through a 30-minute sermon just sitting there and listening to it. So an hour plus presentation, that'd be enough to kill a small horse. So we're going to talk back and forth. All right, is that cool? All right. So what I want to know is, why don't you turn to a partner? So go ahead and make eye contact with somebody, not from across the way, but turn so that they know that you're partnering with them. If you have to get in a group of 3, that's fine. So once you can go left or right. Okay, raise your hand if you need a partner. Okay, everybody got one? If it's groups of 3, again, that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to give you 60 seconds to 2 minutes and talk through some of these questions. Okay, number 1, why did you choose this breakout session? Why are you here as opposed to the other ones? Number 2, do you ever have religious or spiritual conversations with non-believers? How do those tend to go? Are there any obstacles or challenges that you don't know how to handle? And have you ever heard this? Something like this. Maybe not exactly these words, but kind of along these lines. What's true for you might not be true for me. Does something like that ever come up? Do you see this in media, social media, in your classes, in the news, anywhere? Just talk through as many of those questions with your partners as you can, and we'll kind of share it. All right? So go ahead and get it done. Okay, so let's get a little back and forth going here. Raise your hand if you want to share. I'll start calling people when I see 4 or 5 hands going in the air, so I'm not going to call on people right away. Who wants to be brave first person? 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. So go ahead. So this is like they're looking at the conversation, it's kind of like you're talking about ice cream flavors? Sort of like that? Like when you said they don't feel the need to figure out truth. Right? So they're just looking at it as a personal choice. Your choice is as good as mine. It's like you choose, what's your favorite ice cream? Vanilla. My favorite ice cream is chocolate. So we know which one's better. Either one, right? So is it kind of like that's how the conversation, how they kind of characterize it? Okay, good. Good. Who else raised their hand here? Go ahead. Any of them. Can anybody talk about why you chose this session? Like what stands out about it? Go ahead. I'm glad all of you are here. Hopefully we'll have a fun time together. So, as stated, the topic of this seminar, of this breakout session, is relativism. It's ubiquitous. When I'm teaching my students, we have conversations a lot. You know, class discussion is a pillar of my classroom, even in this Zoom and Google Meet way of doing education, which, is anybody a fan of that? I don't know, I'm not, I hate it. But even in that atmosphere, we have a lot of conversations, and this stuff comes up all the time in my classroom. And it's kind of like just the water, it's in the water, it's in the air that we breathe. So you might hear slogans like this, or something like this, and it's true for you, might not be true for me. There's no moral absolutes. It all depends on how you're raised. And then the question with the shrug, who's to say? As if that doesn't have an answer to it, and kind of like that's a silver bullet that to shut you up or something like that. And then you shouldn't force your morality on others. Does any of this sound familiar in your conversations? Okay, it should. It comes up a lot of times. So that's kind of relativism in a slogan sense, kind of like a popular sense. What I'm going to take a few minutes to do is explain, go a little bit deep. Explain kind of where this comes from and the arguments that generate that sort of outlook, and then we'll evaluate it and move on from there. Okay. So let's take any sort of moral statement. Say murder is wrong. So a real clear-cut example. The branch of metaethics, which is a branch of philosophy. I know Elisa said to use the word textual criticism at a party. Don't do that with this one because we'll probably just roll their eyes and think you're trying to show off or something. The metaethics is the branch of philosophy that deals with what moral statements mean. Okay? So you've got to ask, what does that mean? There's a couple of sub-questions in the larger general question. Number one, is the statement capable of being true or false? And if it is, what is the statement about? Okay? So there's a lot of different viewpoints answering those two questions, but I'm going to give you, the main players here. The first one is called emotivism. Emotivism answers the first question: is that statement capable of being true or false? And the answer is no, according to emotivism. And emotivists just hold that when I make moral statements like that, I'm not saying anything about anything. It's just a kind of an emotional statement. I'm just kind of saying, when I say Donald Trump's behavior in the last couple of months is reprehensible or something like that, I just mean boo Trump, or not even that much, just like ugh, just kind of emotive. So the emotivist, that's what moral statements mean. There's nothing more to them than just kind of an emotional outburst, right? Then you have moral realism. Moral realism is the view that moral statements like murder is wrong. They're actually, number one, they're capable of being true or false. They're about something. And what they're about is something in the world. Okay, so there is, when I say murder is wrong, what I mean by that is I'm talking about the action of murder, namely that it has a certain quality, a moral quality of wrongness. Okay, so I'm not saying something about me, I'm saying something about that act itself. All right, moral realism. Moral statements are real, true, and false statements about the world. Then you've got moral subjectivism. There's a couple different flavors of this, which I'll distinguish in a moment. But according to moral subjectivism, are moral statements capable of being true and false? The answer is yes. What are they about? Which is the second question. They're about me. They're about the speaker. They're about the perceiving subject, hence the word subjectivism. They're not about the act of murder. I'm saying something about myself. Okay? So, you guys get the distinction between the three views. Alright, do I need to clarify any further? Okay. So, that, like I said, there's other viewpoints, but those are kind of the main ones. And subjectivism is further broken down to a more individual kind of subjectivism and a more cultural kind of subjectivism. You might hear some authors say, I say relativism versus society says relativism. So according to an I say subjectivist, I'm just saying something about myself. Okay, so I determine whether that statement is true or false. And you might have a different view. And, when you say murder is wrong, you mean something else. So it's relative to the individual. Okay, hence what's true for you may not be true for me. According to a more cultural subjectivist, moral rules or moral statements are what they call social constructions. So the synonym for this is constructivism. Some people call it social contract theory. It's all kind of the same. What the social contract theorist has in common with a more individual subjectivist is that they both hold that moral rules and moral statements are creations of human beings. There's nothing more to them than that. So there's nothing that's called transcendent, over and above the culture, or over and above the individual. It's all a creation of the human being. So this is clear enough with individual subjectivists. But let me kind of give a little analogy or an illustration to kind of help you wrap your minds around what a cultural subjectivist might hold. So they think that moral rules are social constructions. So what is a social construction? Think of it like sports rules. Okay? Social constructions are rules or beliefs or whatever that are created by different groups, and they don't have any sort of authority or validity outside that group. So you got rules for football, and then you got rules for boxing, right? And the different athletes and the different associations create those rules. And so if you try to take the rules for football and you try to apply them in the ring, it's not going to work, right? So if you tackle a guy that you're boxing, that's illegal. You can't play boxing like you play football, and vice versa. If you take the rules for boxing and you try to apply them on the gridiron, you start knocking your opponent upside the head, that's illegal. Because those rules don't have any authority outside of those sports. Does that make sense? So a social contract theorist is going to think that moral rules are like that. They're just creations of different groups. And every group has their different moral rules that work for them. Okay? Another example would be what side of the road you drive on. So in America, we drive on, what is it, the right side of the road? Yeah. In Britain, I have to think about that. In Britain, you drive on the other side of the road. Well, when Britain drives, the Brits do. When America drives, the Americans do. There's no validity. You can't drive in Britain like you drive in America, and vice versa. They have different social constructions. So a social contract theorist or a moral subjectivist who caches moral rules out that way is going to reduce morality to that. They're just like social constructions, like driving on the left side versus the right side of the road, or eating spaghetti with a fork versus chopsticks. Okay? Get the analogy? All right. So, another question. I want you guys to turn to your partner and talk. We're going to focus on subjectivism. All right, today. We're not going to focus on emotivism, and we're going to compare it with moral realism in a minute. But that's the view. What I want you to turn and talk to your partner about is what sort of arguments do you hear your friends giving for that view? Okay, it's got synonyms. They might not say, I'm a moral subjectivist. They might call themselves a relativist. They might not even know what it means. But you can sense the view, right? So what sort of arguments do you hear coming from our culture that support that view? All right, go ahead and turn to your partner and talk. Okay, I know that was a short little discussion, but what do you got? Anybody want to try to kind of put yourselves in the shoes of a moral relativist? How would they justify that view? Just stating the view doesn't mean it's true, right? How would they justify it? Any ideas? Go ahead. There you go. Right, you guys hear what she said? Different cultures have deeply embedded ways of living, and they conflict with one another, and so that's how they get their different moral rules, and they don't mix. Okay, so it's called the argument from diversity. Argument from diversity is basically, I'm sorry, what's your name? Desiree. It's basically what Desiree said. Different cultures have diverse moral practices. And so the best explanation for that is that moral rules are just social constructions because it all depends on how you're raised. Okay? Yeah. What else? What other arguments you guys come up with? So what's your name? Kumi? Okay, so Kumi, there's no way to prove. Why did they say there's no way to prove? Okay. Yeah. You said the key word. Science. Right? This is the Bill Nye view. This is what I call the pictures or it didn't happen. Okay, the argument for, in terms of this is, you can't hear moral rules, you can't see, you can't touch them, science can't test them. And we get knowledge from science. We get knowledge from our five senses. And so since moral rules, if they were real, they would be what's called immaterial, that means non-physical in nature. Well, they lie outside the purview of science. And so that means that they're just opinion, they're just faith. Whatever science can't get at, you can't know it. Okay? Pictures or it didn't happen. If you ever listen to Bill Nye for any point in time, after 60 seconds, he'll start saying something. Okay? The third one is they redefine certain virtues. They kind of stack the deck. Okay? So virtues like tolerance and humility. They'll say, well, if you argue that you're right, if you think that you're right, that's arrogant. That's the opposite of humility. So you need to be tolerant, open-minded, which means that you need to allow other people to say their conscience, or vote their conscience, or live their conscience. And you need to acknowledge that your personal moral views are just that. They're personal moral views, and they don't universally apply to everyone. If you think they do, then that's intolerant. Okay? A textbook example of this, or rather pernicious example of this, is a 1960s essay by a guy named Herbert Marcuse named Repressive Tolerance. It's a really difficult essay to understand, but this is how a lot of our media, a lot of our cultural makers, Instagram influencers, this is how they think. It's based on that essay. They might not have ever read it, but this is kind of how they think. It's a very asymmetrical view of tolerance. So it's not you tolerate me, I tolerate you. It's whatever forwards and progresses the revolution in terms of liberating people from oppression. And of course, oppression and liberation is defined just in their terms. It's just synonymous with what they believe. And then whatever lies outside that very narrow definition of liberation, it cannot be tolerated. It can't be allowed to be said. And everything else that progresses the revolution in terms of liberating people from oppression, whatever allows for that or helps that, even violence must be tolerated. Everything else you can't even allow to be said. So the word that he actually uses in the essay, does anybody here take German? It's just the word aufgehoben. So Dr. Seuss used to be good, but now, according to our modern standards, it's rather backwards according to this way of thinking. And so it's aufgehoben. You know what that word means? It literally means canceled. That's the word that he uses in the essay. He doesn't Dr. Seuss, of course, but that's a great example the last couple of days. You've kind of been reading what happened with Dr. Seuss. It's exactly that. Redefining these virtues as, in a way that kind of rigs the game. Okay, so that's the third argument. Fourth argument is called the fact-opinion distinction. If I was a betting man, which I'm not, but if I were, I would put money down that you guys actually buy into this. Okay? Because this is a pillar of our education system. Okay? So let's do a little bit of test here. You guys are going to tell me if what's up there on the screen is a fact or an opinion. Okay, that's number one. George Washington was the first president of the United States. Fact or opinion? Fact. Good. Number two, the atomic number of gold is 79. At least I think it's 79. I Googled it. 79. Fact or opinion? Fact. Okay, so far so good. You guys made an A. How about number three? Cursing in school is inappropriate. Fact or opinion? Opinion. Number four, it's wrong for people who are 21 to drink alcohol. Fact or opinion? Okay, this will bother you. Women should stay at home to take care of the kids. Fact or opinion? Opinion. Copying homework is wrong and drug dealers belong in prison. Both of those are opinions. Okay. So there's a distinction between a fact and opinion. Facts, things that you can know, things that you can have concrete proof for, things that can be true or false, right? That's the definition of fact. Opinion, just what you think, feel, or believe. Emphasis on the word just. Okay? So, in those examples, numbers 3 through 7, they're all moral statements, right? And which category did you put them in? The opinion category, right? So, since all moral statements or moral values or moral beliefs are in the opinion category, there are no moral facts, and therefore there's no universal morality that applies outside of you. It's just what you think, feel, believe. It's just your opinion. And opinions, since they're opinions, they're not true or false. You can't prove them, you can't know them, because that will make them a fact. Okay? And so that's the last argument for relativism. So let's do a little more engagement here. Okay? We're going to keep doing the same pattern over and over again. Which argument do you think is the strongest? And what do you think about them? Can you think of any responses? Can you think of anything to say in response to them? Okay? So go ahead and turn back to your partner and talk for a little bit, and then we'll come back and talk with me. Yeah, so the argument from diversity, facts or it didn't happen, redefining certain virtues, and then the fact-value distinction, the fact-opinion distinction. Which one do you think is the strongest, and can you come up with any sort of responses to them? So I would love to talk to you guys, let you talk further, but I've got a lot of material to get through. So let's come back here. We're going to go over responses in just a second, but I want to see if you guys can kind of stretch your brains, stretch your minds first before I go over some of the flaws in them. So what'd you come up with? What do you think is the strongest? What can you say in response? Go ahead. Can you think of anything to say in response? All right, thank you. Let's get one more. You might want to pinpoint an argument and come up with a response to it. Go ahead. They'll just label it as faith talk and kind of ignore it. That's what you're saying? What would you say in response to that? Okay. So, in other words, you you would give some evidence to show that it's not just blind faith, but there's something concrete to it. Okay, good. Let's go one more, and then we'll move on. Good. I'm going to come back to that. It's basically the skill of asking questions. It's kind of where you're at. So that's good. All right. So let's get into some responses. First, I'm going to give you guys some homework. All right. More homework. Yes. I am. Man, you guys got to take your discipleship seriously, man. It takes hard study. So be willing to burn the midnight oil to develop your minds. So I'm going to give you 2 books and 1 news article or opinion article. And the reason why is because the rest of my material is going to build on that foundation. Okay? I'm not going to rehash what these very excellent books cover. So I'm not going to cover all the flaws of relativism. These guys do a great job of it. So read these books so you kind of get a fuller picture. That's kind of where I'm coming from here. So the first book is a book called Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. Love that metaphor. Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair by a guy named Greg Koukl. It's Koukl. And Frank Beckwith. Koukl is a California guy, and Frank Beckwith is a professor at Baylor. So that gives a very thorough breakdown of relativism and its flaws. The second is another book by Greg Koukl. It's called Tactics in Defending the Faith. And young lady who spoke last, I'm sorry, what's your name? Jessica. He talks about what Jessica brought up, how to use questions to move in a conversation and maneuver. Okay, so really good stuff. And then the third is an article from the New York Times. It was published several years ago, 2013-ish, by a guy named Justin McBrayer, M-C-B-R-A-R. And it's titled, Why Our Children Don't Believe in Moral Facts. And he tackles that last argument, the fact, opinion, distinction. He kind of shows some of its flaws. All right, so there's your homework. You guys say thank you, Mr. Bordner. You're welcome. That's why I'm paying the big bucks. All right, so let's do a couple of responses here. All right. The first issue with relativism is that it commits a logical fallacy. It's called a non sequitur. Non sequitur. Don't be intimidated by the name. It's Latin. It just means it does not follow. So a non sequitur fallacy is any time when your support for your argument does not prove what you think it proves. Okay? So like I said, literally means it does not follow. So your premises, or rather your conclusion, where you're trying to get to, does not follow from what's called your premises, your support and your evidence. All right? So if you think of an argument like a house, you've got, a lot of different parts of the house, right? But for this illustration, you've got 2 basic parts of the house. You've got the walls, you've got the roof. Your roof would be your conclusion, that's kind of where you're trying to get to. Your walls would be your proof or your evidence or your supports. The whole house together is the argument when you've got the walls and your premises, your support, and your roof, your conclusion. Okay? A non sequitur is when you've got a roof over here and the walls over here. They don't connect. Alright? So it's any time that there's a disconnect in your support and your conclusion. So a good example would be this. So let's say I said this. Well, since, I don't know, this analogy might fall flat. You'll see when I say it, but I'm going to go ahead and do this. What I have written down. Since the Browns won a playoff game, I'm going to grow 6 inches in the next week. You guys know what the Browns are? Football team? Okay. All right, something like that. This is Texas. I'm an Ohio boy, so that's kind of why I thought of the Browns. It was like, man, they won a playoff game. It was like the first time in, 25 years or something like that. So, yeah, if I said the Cowboys, maybe more you would get it. But, yeah, since the Browns won a playoff game, I'll grow 6 inches in the next week. You're like, what does that have to do with it? Browns win a playoff game? Well, nothing. It's a non sequitur. So a lot of the arguments that I presented a couple minutes ago, they commit this fallacy. All right, so let's take the argument from diversity, right? Let's say that it were true that different cultures have radically different conflicting moralities. That's not as true as it might seem, but let's just stipulate that, okay? Does it follow from mere difference of belief that there is no fact of the matter? Think about that for a second. It doesn't, right? Just because people have different beliefs or different cultures have different beliefs, it doesn't follow that you can't know what's true. All right, to see this, think about, it's the same point we're applying science. Well, we in America, we have a certain belief about the shape of the world. We've got a lot of evidence for it. But there's different cultures in different primitive societies that might not have the same beliefs. Well, does it follow from that alone, from mere difference of belief, from diversity of belief, that we can't know if the world is round or not? No. And people might say, well, that's science, and in science we have facts, and morality is different. Well, now what you're doing is called begging the question. Begging the question means that you are assuming what you're trying to prove. That's the issue. That's the very issue that the person is trying to argue for. They're trying to argue for, morality being this opinion thing and science being a factual thing. And you can't just state it as if it's obvious. It's arguing in a circle. Okay, so that would be a non sequitur plus begging the question. You guys follow, or do you need me to kind of re-explain things in a different way? If so, just let me know. I'm happy to break it down differently. Okay? Some of these other arguments are also non sequiturs. So some people say, well, in different situations, there's going to be, a different morally appropriate action. So if you're in war, killing someone's okay. But, if you're carjacking somebody, killing somebody's not okay. Well, see there, morality is relative. Well, again, that's a non sequitur. It does not follow that because different situations yield different morally appropriate actions, that therefore morality is relative. Strictly speaking, you're talking about two totally different moral situations. You're not even talking about the same thing. Okay, so killing in self-defense versus killing in the act of theft, those are two different moral discussions, and you can't conclude from that therefore morality is relative. Yeah, different situation, the context and the environment of the situation might inform your moral judgment, but it does not mean that therefore morality is subjective, that it's determined by the individual or by the culture. It does not follow. It's a non sequitur. Okay? Same thing for those who say that, they might use, kind of how we observe different primates. They'll say, well, if you look at certain primate colonies, they have, they practice altruism. They punish those who break their moral rules. So they have a form of morality. See, that proves that evolution has programmed it into us, that morality is relative. Again, that's a non sequitur. Just because, certain primate animals behave in ways that we call moral, it does not mean that the whole moral project itself is a subjective thing. Non sequitur. That would be, we're just describing the behaviors of certain animals. And you can't draw any sort of conclusions about morality itself, which is prescriptive. It tells us what we ought to do. So you can't go from certain descriptions about what is, namely, facts about certain animals, and then draw a conclusion from that to, morality, which is an ought thing, a prescriptive thing. That's, again, a non sequitur. And most of the arguments fail that test. Their support does not connect with their conclusion. The next error is the argument, the facts that didn't happen argument is self-refuting. And what does that mean? Self-refuting is anytime you make a statement that contradicts itself. It's like, think of the picture in the beginning of the PowerPoint. It shoots itself in the foot. Okay? So let me give you some examples here, some non-moral examples. Let's say somebody walks in and they got a shirt on, and the front of the shirt says, the statement on the back of this shirt is true. And they walk by and you read the back of the shirt, and it says, the statement on the front of this shirt is false. You're like, I don't think that works. Right? Because if it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. It's self-refuting. concept makes sense? Okay. Another example, my sister's brother is an only child. What? Self-refuting. Another example, I do not exist. Then who's doing the talking? Okay, it's self-refuting. There is no truth. Now we're kind of getting more philosophical examples. Somebody says that, you can ask them, is that true? Right, self-refuting. Also, this statement. The only things that we can know are things that are tested by science or verified by the five senses. Let me say that again. The only things that we can know are things that are tested by science or verified by the five senses. That also is self-refuting. Can anybody explain how? How is that statement self-refuting? Give it a shot. Okay? Yeah. To kind of summarize what she said, you can ask them a question. Somebody says something like that. You can ask them, well, what about that statement itself? Which science experiment shows that that statement itself is true? Which sense? Can you feel it, taste it, touch it, yada, yada, yada? The answer is no. So according to its own test, it fails. All right, it's like that picture there. Nothing is written in stone. It's written in stone. Right? So it's like the fisherman on the beach. You're watching him fish. Every time he catches a fish this big, he throws it away. Every time he catches a fish this little, he keeps doing this. You're like, man, that's really confusing. Normally it'd be the other way around. You walk up to him and you say, what's going on? This is weird. You got it backwards. He says, well, no, I only have a 5-inch pan. So fishes that are outside that 5-inch pan, I have to throw away. Fish, little guys that are within that 5-inch pan, I have to keep, or I can keep. So that's what this is the view called scientism. So it's not science proper. It's not the methodology of science, testing the natural world, hypothesis, experimentation, that sort of thing. It is a certain philosophy about science. Okay? So scientism. So that's what scientism does. It takes knowledge, which, big pan, and it narrows it down to a 5-inch pan. So it unduly restricts the realm of knowledge, and then that statement itself, according to its own test, falls outside of the frying pan, of its own frying pan. So that would be a fish that the fisher wouldn't have to throw back. Right? It's self-refuting. So the facts are it didn't happen argument is generated by a view called scientism and is self-refuting. I promise. All right. Now what about, let's skip into go back into the redefinitions. Okay, stacking the deck. All right, so this is rhetorical gamesmanship. As I keep saying the word, it redefines certain virtues in ways that are favorable to that view, so it rigs the game. So think about it. According to this view, tolerance is accepting everybody's views, thinking everybody's right. And if you think somebody's wrong, or if you think that you alone are right and everybody else is wrong, that by definition is intolerant, according to this view. Well, that's a redefinition. That is not what tolerance is. Tolerance is not reserved for those that you agree with. Tolerance is reserved for those you disagree with. Okay, to tolerate somebody, you've got to disagree with what they say. Okay? Tolerance just means that though you disagree with them, you allow them the freedom to state and argue for their view in the public square. You can oppose their view, you can critique it, you can criticize it, even passionately, and still be tolerant. That's classical tolerance. But tolerance today has been redefined, it's been turned on its head, and now it's just something you got to celebrate the other person's beliefs. You got to accept, you have to agree. If you don't, it's intolerant. So it's rigging the game. Same thing for humility. Well, if you think that you're right, that's the opposite of humility. No. Okay, think about it. That's also self-refuting. Is the person who's saying that telling you to be humble, is that something they think that everybody should strive to be? If yes, they've shot themselves in the foot. If no, well, now that just means that humility is just their particular ice cream flavor. And somebody who values hubris, that's no better or worse, which is kind of absurd. Okay? So, turns tolerance, humility on its head. Marcuse does this. The guy who wrote the essay on repressive tolerance in the 60s. He just identifies tolerance with that which supports his ideology. Okay? That's cheating. All right, it's rhetorical gamesmanship. All right, you don't have to tolerate everything, right? So if somebody's advocating violence, or if it's like a Nazi ideology, you don't have to tolerate that. But strictly speaking, classically speaking, tolerance, there's a wide window. Okay, so what Marcuse does is narrow that window and just identifies it with whatever falls inside his particularly defined window. Okay, it's just arguing by defining words in a certain way that favors the stacks of deck. Okay. Now, what about the fact-opinion distinction? Okay, what about the fact-opinion distinction? Well, it's kind of funky because things can be both, right? So let's go back to that list. Number one, George Washington was the first president of the United States. Well, you guys identified that as a fact, but don't you believe it? I hope. So certain things can be facts and opinions. The error is that thinking that they're either or. And then the error also is thinking that opinions can't be true or false. Okay, some opinions are true, some opinions are false. Some opinions can have evidence supporting them, some don't. Okay, just because something is an opinion doesn't mean that it falls outside that true-false realm. It doesn't mean that you can't have evidence for it. That is, to assume otherwise would be just that, an assumption. It's just, again, stipulating something up front, hoping that you don't notice. All right? If you need convincing of that, let's put it this way. Okay? I do this with my students sometimes when they start talking in relativistic ways. I'll bring up a really kind of gnarly example, like George Floyd, something like that, or Bill Cosby. Okay, right in the board, Bill Cosby did was wrong. You say, is that you believe that, right? Yeah. So it's your opinion. Yeah. So you mean to tell me that you don't know that's wrong, but that's just your opinion? And if Derek Chauvin walked in and said the opposite, it'd be like, no, that's absurd. Okay? So you can't, but the point here is you can't have your relativism and your humanity. You got to pick. Either you can be a relativist, and you sacrifice your humanity, and you go with things like, well, I don't know what Bill Cosby did is wrong, that's just my particular belief, but that's just my opinion. But you sacrifice your humanity. Or you can have your humanity and you've got to relinquish your relativism. Okay? Those two things don't mix. All right. How are we doing? You guys still tracking? So, why don't we do this? Let's take a little conversation break here for just a couple minutes. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to give you a couple of conversational tips. Ways that you can deal with relativism when it comes up in a conversation. All right, the tactics book goes, gives you the full treatment. I'll just give you the Bordner's version. Okay. What I want you to do first is to take 2 minutes, turn to a partner, and try to role play a little bit. So one of you is the relativist, the other is not the relativist, and just kind of try to script out a conversation. If this comes up in a conversation, how could you handle it? Think about what I just said. And then try to actually play it out in a live conversation, right? Can you guys do that for me? All right, go for it. safety, when you can make mistakes, when you kind of like, oh, all right, that didn't make sense, let me kind of backtrack and say it again. The more you can actually practice that, the better your conversation is going to go. Okay, so I really recommend that practice of role-playing often, and just kind of brainstorming, how could I respond when somebody says this? All right, that will really help you in your discipleship to figure it out in your head yourself. And it'll also help you in terms of evangelism and being able to, stand in the gap in your classes and whatnot. So I'm going to give you some conversation tips here. All right, first is Jessica, right? Right. So Jessica kind of brought this up. Learn to ask good questions, because if you just like state it up front, like, oh, that's a non sequitur. They might kind of already have their dukes up. They might be defending turf. But if you can ask questions that reveal it, questions have a way of disarming and helping you, keeping control of the conversation better. Like I said, the tactics book kind of gives a fuller treatment of this, but I'll give you a couple of examples here to kind of explain what I mean. Sometimes I'll do this when, gender ideology comes up in my philosophy classes. This just happened a couple of weeks ago, actually, the whole preferred pronouns thing came up. And so this isn't a relativism example, but we kind of demonstrate the principle. And so, I asked the question, what would you say to someone that they were kind of espousing the transgender ideology, you could be a man trapped in a woman's body and vice versa. And so I said, well, what would you say to someone who thinks that boys are all like physical and rough and tumble, while girls, they love dresses, they love wearing makeup, and they love talking about their feelings? What would you say to somebody who stated that? They'd be like, that's stereotyping. Can't do that. How about? Okay, good. I agree. And then I'll ask, what does it mean to be a woman trapped in a man's body? Like, how would you know if you're a man trapped in a woman's body? They'll say, well, if the other person feels like a woman. I say, okay, what does that mean? So you see how I'm asking questions to kind of move you all out of it, right? And then at this point, I'll say, what does it mean to feel like a woman? They can't reference the body, because according to their own view, that's bigotry, that's out of bounds. They can't talk about how the body is structured. And so usually the only game in town, sooner or later, we'll start relying on stereotyping. We'll say, like what Caitlyn Jenner. Caitlyn Jenner loves to wear makeup, and she wears dresses, and feels feminine. It's like the more feminine things. I'll say, well, wait a minute. Just a second ago, you told me that was bigoted stereotyping, and now you're using those very same stereotypes to define what it means to feel like a woman. It seems like you kind of want it both ways. Heads I win, tails I lose. Help me understand that. So you see how I'm using questions instead of just saying like, oh, that's wrong, that don't make no sense. You say that, and then you're coming to you like this. And if you leave with questions, what is that? Here's an example with in the relativism arena. This is actually one that Greg Copeland gives in his book. He's talking to a guy named Gil, and as a office, and Gil's adjusting him, and then they get into a discussion on more issue, and Greg Copeland says something controversial, like from a Christian perspective. And Gil said, that's just the thing with you Christians. You guys are like lovely people, but then you get really judgmental. So then Greg Copeland says, what's wrong with being judgmental? So, okay, so he's asking questions rather than saying like, no, what's wrong with that? And Gil says, well, it's bad to be judgmental. What's wrong? And then Greg says, okay, then why are you judging me? Right now, that's what you're doing. And Gil's like, I've never thought of it that way. All right, I guess it's okay to judge. Just don't force your morals on other people. That's where I come from. So then Greg goes, okay, is what you just said your moral view? Is that your moral belief? And Gil goes, yeah, I said it. And Greg says, okay, don't force it on me then. And then Gil's like, well, you're cheating. It's like, no, I'm not cheating. I'm just playing it back to you. That's what you said. And that's kind of where your view leads. Right? So, learn that skill. Asking good questions. That would be the first conversational tip. Second conversational tip is narrate the conversation. You get into these long conversations, and the points that you make tend to get lost in the fray, lost in the weeds. And the person has a tendency to kind of move the goalpost. Like first it's over here, and then you kick the ball and they move it. It's like Lucy with the football. They keep doing that. Right? And so don't be afraid to hit the pause button and say, all right, let me kind of play back the ground we've covered so far, because I think you're kind of moving the goalposts. And so I just want you to see the points that I made and kind of not forget. Okay, so narrate the conversation. Number 3, do what Greg Cope calls push the hot button. Push the hot button. Okay, this is what I did earlier with George Floyd. And I do this in my classes. You take an issue that they care about, they feel strongly about, and you relativize it. See if it works. And this is an effective tactic because nobody can actually be a relativist. They'll say they're a relativist when they're defending church in a philosophical or evangelistic conversation, but I guarantee you if the person was there on that street corner and saw that happen, they wouldn't reflect on that alternative morality tolerantly. They would react like everybody else reacted. Like that is actually, there's no way that's evil. You know? Because when they're in a real moral situation, their relativism goes out the window. It's just when they're trying to like keep you from pushing Jesus on them, they'll be a relativist, right? So you push the hot button, you take something they care about and you relativize it. I like to do this with the grade in conversation. You guys can't do this because you're not teachers, but this illustrates the point. We're having a conversation, students start being a relativist, and I say, you know what? I don't really like what you said. I'm going to give you a 0 for today. You can't do that. So I just did. Well, that's not fair. That's harmful. That's your morality. Don't push it on me. So well, you're actually being harmful. Everybody agrees. Just because everybody agrees doesn't make you right. Don't push morality on me. I come from a different culture. I'm old school. Well, I'll go to the principal. Okay. Well, now you're reducing morality to power. But it sounds like you actually think that I'm wrong. Because you said the word unfair earlier. Is that just your personal ice cream choice? Or did I actually do something unjust to you? You don't complain to administration because of ice cream choices. You don't complain to administration because somebody has a different point of view. You complain to administration if you were actually wronged and treated in an unfair or unjust manner. That only works if relativism is not true. So you're trying to have it both ways. So there's that narrating of the conversation here. Okay, so push the hot button. You can use some of these in tandem. Don't be afraid to call out dishonesty when people defend turf. Kind of hit the pause button and say, you know what? I get the feeling that you don't really believe what you're saying. I don't think you're really thinking this through. That's kind of what I just did in the docking the grade example. At the end, I kind of say, like, you know what? I don't think you really mean what you say when you say that morality is relative, because you're acting totally different right now. It's like J.P. Moreland, who's a philosopher from Biola University. He says if somebody's being a relativist, steal their stereo. For you guys, it'd be like steal their iPhone. You know what stereos are? Like, then you put your cassette tape in. You know what cassette tape is? Like, okay, boomer. Hey, I'm Gen X. Permanently Gen X. So, anyway, yeah, you don't want to be a jerk about it, but so kind of gently suggest, like, are you really being honest with me here? I kind of feel I'm being trolled. If you witness like a sexual assault or something like that, you're not going to say like, oh, my opinion. I don't think you're being honest. Okay. The hardcore relativist, you're talking to a hardcore relativist that just bites the bullet and won't budge. I've had this at my classes several times. It's like, yep, George Floyd, I might not like what happened to him, but I can't say that's actually wrong. They'll dig their heels in. So then, play to the crowd. Play to the audience. Because you might not be able to make that person budge, all right? At least in that conversation in public, but maybe other people are listening in. And so you're planting seeds in their minds. Maybe there's a new Christian that's kind of intimidated by what that person's saying. And so, having that dialogue and kind of walking through it, well, you don't convince the relativists, but you convince other people that are listening in. Okay, so play the crowd. And then read the room, all right? You don't always need to, bring out your apologetic guns and, shoot it at people. If the person is coming from a place of pride and you sense that, then by all means, it calls for a little more confrontational response, right? But maybe they have real questions. Maybe they've got some pain that they're dealing with, maybe some trauma or something. You got to sense what's going on, because in that case, they might ask you a question, they might kind of bring a challenge in front of you, but going the apologetical route would drive them away instead of the opposite. So get good at reading the room. It's not all like, I got to prove you wrong. This is not about winning a chess match, guys. It's about loving people. It's about figuring out in your head first. Okay, so you have confidence and you're not intimidated by all those hollow and deceptive philosophies that Colossians 2:8 talks about. And then it's about really loving the people that you know, your friends, and having conversations with them. And is there room for confrontation in that? Yeah, that's not the whole game. Okay, I argue most of the game is more relational than that. Okay, so those are my tips. What I want to do in the time we have left, I know this is getting a little long. I want to talk about something that's not relativism itself, but it's kind of related, and it helps relativism flourish in our culture. And it's an ideology point of view called expressive individualism. Okay? And think of this like the petri dish that relativism grows in. So it's not relativism itself, it's not the bacteria itself, it's the dish that it grows in. So you put bacteria in the freezer, it doesn't grow. But you put it in a warm petri dish, a day later, you got all these big flowers and stuff. Okay, so expressive individualism and the way that we think about sexuality these days, relativism would not be allowed, it would not flourish, it would not be as popular as it is without this kind of a background. It's what's called the plausibility structure. It's what makes something sound plausible. Emphasis on the word sound. Okay? So what is expressive individualism? Number one, it's the view, and again, I think probably most of you buy into this, at least to some extent. It's the view that I'm my own. I'm in control of myself. Okay? I define my identity. Period. Full stop. It's the you do you mentality. Or don't let anybody tell you what you can and can't do attitude. Okay? So that's the first thing. The second part of the puzzle is it says that you find meaning and purpose and, most importantly, your identity by looking within and consulting your truth and your desires and your feelings. And then, rather than looking up or rather than looking out to community. Identity is defined by the individual. Okay? Alan Jacobs, who's a professor of literature at Baylor, this is how he puts it. He's not an expressive individualist, but here's how he summarizes it. He says, I am a commodity wholly owned and operated by myself in service to my own interests, as defined by me. That's key. As defined by me. Personal happiness and freedom is the goal of life. Therefore, society is to be evaluated strictly in terms of whether it helps or hinders my autonomy and helps me achieve personal happiness. Okay? So it's very Instagram influencer type of way of looking at it. Okay? Oprah. Right? And then institutions and communities externally are only good to the degree that they enable me to express who I am on the inside. So it's kind of like an inside term to figuring out who I am. And then authenticity, being real, is defined solely in terms of my ability to express that. So I take what's inside and I express it publicly. That's what being authentic means. Okay? You guys hang in there for about another 10 minutes? You okay? Alright. I'll land the plane in about 10 minutes, I promise. So this is a Disney worldview. Okay? Even movies, Disney movies that are supposedly family friendly have this attitude. Where at the center is some beleaguered and put upon individual, and they have certain desires that are out of step with family or out of step with society. The whole movie is their journey of liberation. And it's the outside society's slow realization that they need to accept the individual's desires. So, Adam's Family Values. Watch that movie, that's the whole point. You watch Frozen, that's the whole point. So I know I'm being cheesy here, but let's look at some lyrics. Okay, so let it go. Right? Every kid's favorite song. Their favorite Disney movie. Look at that. The fears that once controlled me can't get to me at all. It's time to see what I can do, test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. That's one stanza in that song. That's a constant drumbeat of Disney movies. Okay? So it's all over our culture. This is the dominant way that we think about identity. It's just defined by you. You've got to be free to express it. Okay? Now, the sexuality angle of this comes from Freud. So, ever since Freud, our culture has thought of sexual desires as not just desires. They're not just feelings that lead to behaviors. They're instead a core part of my identity. So you combine all that together, and this is where we get, you know, I've got to be free to live out my identity, which sexual desire is a core part of that. And then so any sort of limiting category, like Christian morality, that gets in the way of that is oppressive. And it's got to be, you got to get rid of it. You got to escape it. And this is how our culture thinks. So real quick here, give me about 5 to 6 more minutes, and then we'll be done. Let me give a short kind of evaluation of this. All right, where does this go wrong? Number one, it gives you a false view of human nature. We're not designed to get our meaning from ourselves by looking within. We don't have the kind of heft for that. We are very poor creators of our own meaning. We can't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Okay? So that's the first thing. Second thing is that this sort of view rejects any sort of unchosen limitation as oppression. But if you think about it, some limits are good. Some limits you can't get past. Some limits I did not choose, and that's fine. You got to learn to live within those limits. G.K. Chesterton said, before you tear up a fence post, ask why it was there in the first place. Okay? And expressive individualism can't deal with that. Fence post has to come up. Got to pull it up. So think about this. Think about my body. My body is a limit. All right? What prevents me from being Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, has nothing to do with my mind and everything to do with my body. It's in space. It's particular. You know, it's a male body, and it's not to be rejected. You know, kind of weird that we talk all this about body positivity, and then if somebody does not like their sex, does not, you know, the gender is at odds with their sex, and then, you know, all that goes out the window. Well, my body's good. Give it to me by God. And I'm to steward it and take care of it and love it, not reject it as some sort of intolerable limit. Okay, so that's the second thing. Limits, at least some limits are good, and you can't get by them. Can't get past them. Number 3, those who adopt this view, they have an awfully hard time justifying it. So explain questions like, why is this look inside, you know, what I call the inner mood? Why is that the right place to look for truth, identity, and meaning? Think about it. We just kind of take it as, you know, take it for granted, take it as obvious, but it's not obvious. Right? Why should we be looking inside to our feelings first when it comes to identity? Why is that good? Why should each person's identity be equated with their desires? And why is authenticity synonymous with expressing those same desires rather than Jesus' view? You know, what does it say in Matthew 16? You want to lose yourself, or you want to save your life, you got to lose it. You got to take it across and you got to die to self. That's Jesus' view of authenticity. Why is the modern view better than that? Really it is. Nobody ever answers those questions well because we don't ask them. And then just a couple more things, 2 to 3 minutes here. The easiest way to see through this expressive individualism and see it for the facade of it is to just say it's weird. You know, my students just yesterday were saying, you know, in a conversation, they said, yeah, you gotta be you, you gotta be who you are, man. And I said, well, yeah, but what if you're a jerk? Okay, we instantly recognize, if you think about it, there's some identities are not worth having. Some identities are not worth expressing. Okay, just because you feel it doesn't mean it's got to be expressed. All right, and we come at that, we arrive at that not by looking within, but by looking to an external standard. Read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. It's exactly how he argued, how he justified what he was doing against those who were saying, you got to be nice. You can't do that. He said, no, look, man, I look to a law above the law. I'm not looking at myself. I'm looking to God's law. And whatever is contradicting that is unjust. Whatever is in line with that is just. So he looked externally. It's like what Brett Kumpel says. He's a guy that works with you, actually. He says, telling those who aren't virtuous to look inside is like telling them to find their way out of a wilderness using a compass that always points to them. A compass works because it points to something fixed and unchanging by which we can orient ourselves and find our way. In the same way, unless there is a fixed moral reference point outside of ourselves by which we can make moral decisions, we'll always be lost. We've told a whole generation to go find themselves, but what if they find themselves, they find that they're jerks? Okay? And then the last thing on sexual ethics, look, this is what's called a category mistake. A category mistake is when you use the wrong category to talk about an issue. So it's like saying, how much does the color blue weigh? Or what color is the note C? Or trying to weigh a chicken with a yardstick. It's the wrong category to think about sexual desire. Okay? Sex is not identity. Okay? Your sexual desires, my sexual desires, they're not core of who we are inside. Now look, sex doesn't matter. Okay? It's sacred. But it's a sacred act. Okay? It's a sacred act. It's the only act capable of creating a new human life, right? But it's not your core identity, right? And some people say, well, you're cheating, you're heterosexual, that's who you are. Strictly speaking, it's not. Yes, I have desires, and those desires that are in line with God's views are, good. But it's not like, I've got wayward desires every day. That's not who I am. It's like Samuel Albury says, desires for things that God has forbidden are a reflection of how sin has distorted me, not how God has made me. Okay? And so I went down this rabbit trail because, this is kind of what makes relativism so popular in our culture. So you got to get the root. All right. Another book recommendation on this, on expressive individualism, is The Rise and Triumph of Modern Self by Carl Trueman. Just came out a couple months ago. Really good book. It's kind of heavy. All right. It's tough sledding, but it really explains the more full picture where all this is coming from. The rise and triumph of the modern self. All right. So we're kind of coming to a close here. I want to reiterate what this is about, guys. This is not about winning a chess match. That's not the role of apologetics. The role of apologetics is, number one, developing your own backbone. Okay? You guys are going to be resilient, especially when you get off to college. You're going to need some courage. And courage just isn't something that you can just will. It's something that's built over time as a habit of long study. The more that you guys study, the more you guys take your discipleship seriously and dig into the intellectual parts of our faith, the more confident you're going to be, the more courage you're going to have. And then when you get these ideologies coming at you and people are calling you names because of it, you're going to be okay. Because you're going to see it for what it is, a bigger time. Okay? Second thing is it allows you to love people better. Okay? You're not trying to win an argument. You're not trying to own somebody. You're trying to gently walk them through, certain issues that come up. Okay? So I want you to have that mentality about it, not this, kind of gamesmanship thing that sometimes apologists can get into. All right? We got about a minute or two for questions. If you guys want to ask a question, you can, but otherwise we are done. It's been a long hour and 10 minutes. Yes?
Just to talk about other people's perspectives, what are some mistakes? You touched on this a little bit, I appreciate it. What are some mistakes that we can deal with as Christians and not to make when we're getting these conversations?
Great question. I think the biggest thing, this could be a whole talk about itself. The biggest thing is don't fall into the faith-knowledge dichotomy. What I mean by that is people define faith very unbiblically. They define faith as, belief without evidence. And sometimes as Christians, we fall into that. We're like, yeah, man, you just got to have faith. And if that's kind of the message that you're going to be sending to an outside world, it's going to fall on deaf ears. And it's also not the view of Jesus, and it's not the view of Paul, and it's not the biblical view. They do use that word of faith, but it doesn't mean belief without evidence. Okay? You're going to find, throughout this whole day, you're going to find evidence. Right? Okay? You can know that Christianity is true. It's not a faith tradition, at least not in the way that I just defined it. It's a knowledge tradition. Okay? It's something that you can know, not by blind faith. It's something you can know because there's good concrete stuff there. Is that, can I answer every question for you? No. But enough to show that Christianity is head and shoulders above the rest. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question? All right. Guys, we're done. Go to lunch. Thank you.